On a cold January morning in 1929, in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, a child was born who would forever alter the course of American history. Michael King Jr., later renamed Martin Luther King Jr., entered a world where the color of one's skin determined not just opportunities, but the very essence of human dignity. The segregated South of the 1920s was a landscape of profound contradictions, a region where Christian values were preached from every pulpit, yet the fundamental principle of human equality was systematically denied to millions. The King household on Auburn Avenue stood as a beacon of middle-class respectability in a community that had learned to find strength in unity. Martin Luther King Sr., known affectionately as Daddy King, was more than just a Baptist preacher. He was a man who had clawed his way from the cotton fields of rural Georgia to become one of Atlanta's most respected religious leaders. His journey from sharecropper's son to influential pastor embodied the very dreams he would later instill in his children. Alberta Williams King, Martin's mother, brought her own legacy of education and refinement to the family. As the daughter of A.D. Williams, the founding pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, she carried within her the musical traditions and intellectual curiosity that would profoundly shape young Martin's worldview. The Auburn Avenue of Martin's childhood was a vibrant corridor of African-American life, often called Sweet Auburn for its thriving businesses, churches, and cultural institutions. Here, in this protective cocoon of Black excellence, young Martin experienced his first taste of what life could be when freed from the crushing weight of white supremacy. The neighborhood barbershops buzzed with political discussions, the churches resonated with powerful sermons about justice and redemption, and the schools fostered an environment where Black children could dream beyond the limitations imposed by segregation. Yet, even within this nurturing environment, the harsh realities of Jim Crow could not be entirely shut out. Martin's first encounter with racial prejudice came at the tender age of 6, when his white playmate's father forbade their friendship, declaring that his son could no longer associate with a colored child. The confusion and hurt that registered on young Martin's face that day would be seared into his memory forever. His mother, with tears in her eyes, sat him down and explained the incomprehensible, that some people believed the color of their skin made them superior to others. These early experiences with racism were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic pattern that would shape Martin's understanding of injustice. When he was forced to give up his seat to a white passenger on a bus ride home from a debate competition, the humiliation burned deep into his consciousness. The young man, who had just won a speaking contest about the Constitution, found himself confronting the bitter irony that the very document he had eloquently defended denied him basic human dignity. The King family's approach to these challenges was rooted in their deep Christian faith and their belief in education as the pathway to liberation. Daddy King, despite his own limited formal education, was determined that his children would have every educational advantage possible. He enrolled Martin in David T. Howard Colored Elementary School, where the boy's intellectual gifts quickly became apparent. Teachers marveled at his precocious vocabulary and his ability to absorb complex ideas with remarkable ease. Martin's academic excellence was matched by his growing awareness of the power of words. In the King household, dinner conversations were intellectual exercises where current events, theology, and philosophy were discussed with the same passion that other families might reserve for sports or entertainment. Young Martin learned to articulate his thoughts with precision and to defend his ideas with logical arguments. These skills would prove invaluable in his later role as a civil rights leader. The influence of his maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, cannot be overstated in understanding Martin's early development. Williams had been a pioneering figure in Atlanta's civil rights movement, organizing boycotts against discriminatory practices and using his pulpit to advocate for social justice. Through stories and personal example, he taught young Martin that Christianity was not merely about personal salvation, but about creating a more just society on earth. As Martin entered his teenage years, his intellectual curiosity led him to question many of the fundamental assumptions of his upbringing. He began to grapple with theological questions that would later inform his philosophy of nonviolent resistance. How could a loving God permit such suffering and injustice? How could Christians reconcile their faith with their participation in systems of oppression? These questions tormented the young man and drove him to seek answers in the writings of great thinkers and theologians. The seeds of Martin's future leadership were planted during these formative years in Atlanta. The combination of loving family support, excellent education, deep religious faith, and direct experience with injustice created a unique individual who would possess both the intellectual tools and the moral conviction necessary to challenge an entire social system. The boy who had once been told he couldn't play with white children would grow up to envision a world where such barriers no longer existed. At the tender age of 15, Martin Luther King Jr. embarked on a transformative journey that would fundamentally reshape his understanding of himself and his place in the world. In 1944, he walked through the gates of Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, carrying with him the hopes and dreams of a family that had invested everything in the power of education. Morehouse was no ordinary institution. It was a beacon of African American intellectual excellence, a place where young Black men were molded into leaders who would challenge the status quo and fight for justice. The significance of Martin's enrollment at Morehouse extended far beyond personal achievement. This was the same institution that had educated his father and grandfather, creating a legacy of leadership that spanned generations. Morehouse College, founded in 1867, had earned its reputation as the premier institution for cultivating African American leadership. Its motto, Et facta est lux, and there was light, perfectly captured the transformative power of education that the college sought to instill in its students. Martin's admission to Morehouse came through a special wartime program designed to address the shortage of college students during World War II. The program allowed academically gifted high school juniors to enter college early, and Martin's exceptional intellectual abilities made him an ideal candidate. However, despite his obvious talents, he arrived at Morehouse with significant academic deficiencies. His reading skills were at an 8th grade level, a humbling reality that forced him to confront the limitations of his segregated education. The atmosphere at Morehouse was unlike anything Martin had previously experienced. Here, professors were free from the constraints of state funding that might limit their academic freedom, allowing them to engage in open and honest discussions about race, politics, and social justice. The faculty encouraged students to think critically about the racial problems facing America and to seek rational solutions to these seemingly intractable issues. For the first time in his life, Martin found himself in an environment where intellectual curiosity about racial justice was not only tolerated, but actively encouraged. During his freshman year, Martin encountered a work that would profoundly influence his future philosophy and approach to social change. Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience introduced him to the concept that individuals have a moral obligation to resist unjust laws. Thoreau's principled stand against slavery in the Mexican-American War, demonstrated through his refusal to pay taxes and his willingness to go to jail for his beliefs, resonated deeply with the young student. The idea that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good would become a cornerstone of Martin's later philosophy of nonviolent resistance. The intellectual environment at Morehouse was complemented by the presence of extraordinary faculty members who served as mentors and role models for the students. Dr. Benjamin Mays, the college president, was a towering figure in African American intellectual circles. Known as the Dean of the Negro Church in America, Mays was a scholar, theologian, and social activist who embodied the kind of intellectual ministry that Martin had never before imagined possible. Mays conducted weekly chapel services that were more like graduate seminars in theology and social ethics, challenging students to think deeply about the relationship between faith and social action. Dr. George Kelsey, a professor of religion and philosophy, also played a crucial role in Martin's intellectual development. Kelsey's sophisticated approach to theology and his ability to engage with complex philosophical questions while maintaining his commitment to social justice showed Martin that the ministry could be both intellectually rigorous and socially relevant. These men demonstrated that it was possible to be both a serious scholar and a committed activist, a realization that would prove pivotal in Martin's eventual decision to enter the ministry. Martin's participation in the Intercollegiate Council marked another significant milestone in his personal development. This organization facilitated interactions between students from different racial backgrounds, providing Martin with his first meaningful opportunities to engage with white students as equals. These experiences began to soften the resentment toward white people that had been building within him since childhood. He discovered that not all white people were committed to maintaining the system of racial oppression, and that some were genuinely interested in working toward racial reconciliation. The transformation in racial attitudes was gradual but profound. The anger and bitterness that had characterized his earlier responses to racial injustice began to give way to a more nuanced understanding of the complexities of race relations. He began to see that hatred and resentment were ultimately self-destructive emotions that would hinder rather than help the cause of racial justice. This evolution in his thinking would prove crucial in his later development of a philosophy based on love and nonviolence, rather than hatred and retaliation. Despite his growing intellectual sophistication, Martin continued to struggle with the question of his future career path. The ministry, which had seemed like his natural destiny given his family background, no longer held the same appeal. He had witnessed too many ministers who seemed more concerned with personal comfort than social justice. Too many churches that preached love on Sunday while tolerating hatred and discrimination throughout the week. He began to consider careers in law or medicine, fields where he believed he could make a more direct contribution to improving the lives of African Americans. However, the influence of Dr. Mays and Dr. Kelsey gradually began to change his perception of what the ministry could be. These men showed him that the pulpit could be a powerful platform for social change, that the church could be an institution for justice rather than just personal salvation. They demonstrated that it was possible to be both intellectually honest and spiritually committed, to engage with the great philosophical and theological questions of the day while remaining grounded in practical concerns for human welfare. As Martin progressed through his years at Morehouse, his speaking abilities continued to develop and mature. He joined the debate team and participated in oratorical contests, honing the skills that would later make him one of the most powerful speakers in American history. His professors noted his exceptional ability to synthesize complex ideas and present them in language that was both sophisticated and accessible, a talent that would prove invaluable in his later role as a civil rights leader. The social and political consciousness that had been awakened during Martin's childhood continued to develop during his college years. He began to read widely in philosophy, theology, and political theory, seeking to understand the intellectual foundations of the racial oppression he had experienced firsthand. The works of Plato, Aristotle, Rousseau, and Hobbes provided him with frameworks for understanding justice, equality, and the proper relationship between individuals and society. By his senior year, Martin had experienced what he would later describe as an inescapable call to the ministry. This was not the emotional conversion experience that characterized many religious awakenings, but rather a rational decision based on his growing understanding of the ministry's potential for social transformation. He recognized that he possessed a unique combination of intellectual gifts, oratorical skills, and moral passion that could be effectively channeled through religious leadership. In 1948, at the age of 19, Martin graduated from Morehouse College with a Bachelor of Arts degree in sociology. The young man who had entered college as a somewhat resentful and academically unprepared teenager had been transformed into a confident, intellectually sophisticated, and morally committed young adult. The foundation had been laid for the extraordinary leadership role he would soon assume in the struggle for civil rights and social justice. The autumn of 1948 found Martin Luther King Jr. standing at the Chapter 3, The Dawn of Activism. The autumn of 1948 found Martin Luther King Jr. standing at the threshold of a new chapter in his intellectual and spiritual journey. Having graduated from Morehouse College with a newfound sense of purpose, he enrolled at Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. This decision marked not merely a geographical transition from the segregated South to the more liberal North, but a profound transformation in his understanding of Christianity's role in confronting social injustice. Crozer Seminary, with its predominantly white student body and progressive faculty, would become the crucible where Martin's philosophy of nonviolent resistance would be forged. The seminary environment was a stark contrast to anything Martin had previously experienced. For the first time in his life, he found himself as one of only 6 African American students among nearly 100 seminarians. This minority status, rather than intimidating him, seemed to sharpen his focus and intensify his commitment to academic excellence. He was acutely aware that his performance would be scrutinized not just as an individual achievement, but as a reflection of his race's intellectual capabilities. This pressure, while burdensome, drove him to maintain the highest academic standards and to engage more deeply with theological and philosophical questions than ever before. During his first year at Crozer, Martin encountered the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, a discovery that would prove to be one of the most pivotal moments in his intellectual development. Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University, delivered a powerful lecture at the seminary about Gandhi's successful campaign of nonviolent resistance against British colonial rule in India. As Martin listened to Johnson describe how Gandhi had mobilized an entire nation through the power of love and nonviolent protest, he felt as though he had discovered the practical application of Jesus' teachings about loving one's enemies. The concept of satyagraha, Gandhi's term for nonviolent resistance, resonated deeply with Martin's growing understanding of Christian social ethics. Gandhi had demonstrated that it was possible to fight injustice without resorting to violence, to resist evil while maintaining love for one's oppressors. This philosophy offered a third way between the passive acceptance of injustice and the violent retaliation that many oppressed people felt was their only option. Martin began to see how Gandhi's methods could be adapted to the American context, how the principles of nonviolent resistance could be used to challenge the system of racial segregation. Martin's academic performance at Crozer was nothing short of exceptional. He immersed himself in the works of great theologians and philosophers, from Reinhold Niebuhr's Christian realism to Paul Tillich's existential theology. Niebuhr's emphasis on the reality of sin and the limitations of human nature provided a necessary counterbalance to Martin's optimistic belief in the possibility of social transformation. Through Niebuhr, Martin learned to temper his idealism with a realistic understanding of the entrenched nature of social evil, while maintaining his faith in the ultimate triumph of justice. The intellectual rigor of seminary life was complemented by practical experiences that deepened Martin's understanding of ministry and social action. He served as a student pastor at several churches in the Philadelphia area, gaining valuable experience in preaching and pastoral care. These early sermons revealed his growing ability to connect theological concepts with contemporary social issues, to make the ancient message of Christianity relevant to the modern struggle for justice and equality. During his second year at Crozer, Martin's academic interests began to focus increasingly on the relationship between Christianity and social reform. He wrote extensively about the social gospel movement, exploring how theologians like Walter Rauschenbusch had sought to apply Christian principles to social problems. This research reinforced his growing conviction that the church had a responsibility to address not just individual sin, but systemic injustice. He began to envision a form of ministry that would combine spiritual leadership with social activism. The summer of 1950 brought an opportunity that would further broaden Martin's intellectual horizons. He traveled to Hartford, Connecticut, to work on a tobacco farm alongside white college students. This experience provided him with additional insights into race relations outside the South and reinforced his growing belief that racial prejudice was not an insurmountable barrier to human understanding. The friendships he formed with white students during this summer challenged his remaining assumptions about racial differences and strengthened his commitment to the possibility of an integrated society. As Martin entered his final year at Crozer, his reputation as both a scholar and a speaker had grown considerably. His classmates elected him president of the student body, making him the first African American to hold this position in the seminary's history. This honor was particularly significant given the racial climate of the early 1950s and reflected the respect he had earned through his academic achievements and personal character. His election demonstrated that even in an era of widespread racial prejudice, exceptional ability and character could transcend racial barriers. Martin's senior thesis, titled A Conception of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich, revealed the sophistication of his theological thinking and his ability to engage with complex philosophical concepts. The thesis examined Tillich's understanding of God as the ground of being and explored the implications of this concept for Christian theology and practice. This work demonstrated Martin's growing ability to synthesize different theological perspectives and to think critically about fundamental religious questions. The spring of 1951 brought both triumph and decision as Martin prepared to graduate from Crozer Seminary. He had been awarded the Plafker Award as the most outstanding student in his class and had been accepted to several prestigious doctoral programs. After careful consideration, he chose to pursue his PhD in systematic theology at Boston University, attracted by the school's strong reputation in personalist philosophy and the opportunity to study under Dr. Edgar Brightman, one of the leading personalist theologians of the era. The decision to continue his education at Boston University reflected Martin's commitment to intellectual excellence and his desire to develop the theological foundation necessary for effective ministry. He understood that the challenges facing African Americans in the 1950s required leaders who could articulate their cause with both moral authority and intellectual sophistication. The doctoral program would provide him with the advanced theological training necessary to meet these challenges. As Martin prepared to leave Crozer Seminary, he carried with him not just academic credentials, but a fully developed philosophy of social action rooted in Christian love and Gandhian nonviolence. The shy, somewhat resentful teenager who had entered Morehouse College 7 years earlier had been transformed into a confident, intellectually sophisticated young man with a clear sense of his calling to fight injustice through nonviolent means. The 3 years at Crozer had been crucial in shaping Martin's understanding of the relationship between faith and social action. He had learned to see Christianity not as a private religion concerned only with individual salvation, but as a public faith committed to creating the beloved community on earth. This vision would guide him through the challenges that lay ahead and provide the theological foundation for his leadership in the civil rights movement. The young man who boarded the train for Boston in the fall of 1951 was ready to take his place among the intellectual leaders of his generation. He had developed the theological sophistication, moral conviction, and practical wisdom necessary to address the great social challenges of his time. The stage was set for the emergence of one of the most important religious and social leaders in American history. The year 1954 marked a seismic shift in American society that would forever alter the trajectory of civil rights in the United States. On May 17th, the Supreme Court delivered its landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education, declaring that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and effectively overturning the separate but equal doctrine that had legitimized segregation for nearly 60 years. For Martin Luther King Jr., who was completing his doctoral dissertation at Boston University, this momentous ruling represented both vindication of his belief in the possibility of social change and a clarion call to action that would soon transform him from an academic theologian into the most recognizable leader of the civil rights movement. The timing of the Brown decision coincided with a pivotal moment in Martin's personal life. In June 1953, he had married Coretta Scott, a talented musician and activist from Alabama who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. Their courtship had been a meeting of minds and hearts, two young intellectuals who shared a deep commitment to social justice and a vision of a more equitable society. Coretta brought her own passion for civil rights to their relationship, having grown up in rural Alabama. where she had witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of segregation and economic exploitation. As Martin completed his doctoral studies, he faced a crucial decision about his future career path. Several prestigious academic positions were available to him, including opportunities to teach at northern universities, where he could pursue a comfortable life of scholarship and intellectual discourse. However, the pull of the South and the urgent need for leadership in the emerging civil rights struggle proved irresistible. When Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, offered him the position of pastor, Martin saw it as an opportunity to put his theological training and philosophical convictions into practical action. Montgomery in 1954 was a city where the contradictions of the American South were starkly visible. The state capital boasted beautiful antebellum architecture and a proud history, yet it was also a place where African Americans were systematically denied basic human dignity through an elaborate system of segregation laws and customs. The city's bus system epitomized these injustices, with Black passengers required to pay their fare at the front of the bus, then exit and re-enter through the rear door, often watching helplessly as the bus drove away before they could board. Once seated in the designated colored section, they were required to give up their seats to white passengers whenever the white section became full. Martin's arrival at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church was met with both excitement and skepticism from the congregation. At 25 years old, he was younger than many had expected, and his academic credentials, while impressive, had not yet been tested in the crucible of practical ministry. However, his first sermons revealed a preaching style that combined intellectual sophistication with emotional power, theological depth with social relevance. He spoke of Christianity as a transformative force that demanded not just personal salvation but social action, not just individual righteousness but collective justice. The congregation at Dexter Avenue was composed primarily of middle-class African Americans, including professors from Alabama State College, teachers, and business owners who had achieved a measure of economic success despite the constraints of segregation. This educated, relatively affluent membership provided Martin with a platform from which to speak to broader issues of social justice while also presenting unique challenges. Many members were understandably cautious about activities that might jeopardize their hard-won economic security or expose them to white retaliation. Martin's early months in Montgomery were devoted to establishing himself as an effective pastor while also building relationships with other civil rights leaders in the community. He joined the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and began attending meetings of the Montgomery Improvement Association, organizations that were already working to challenge segregation through legal means and economic pressure. These connections introduced him to a network of activists who had been fighting for civil rights long before his arrival and who possessed invaluable knowledge about local conditions and effective strategies for social change. The catalyst for Martin's emergence as a national leader came on December 1, 1955, when Rosa Parks, a seamstress and NAACP activist, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery city bus. Parks's arrest for violating the city's segregation ordinance sparked outrage throughout Montgomery's African American community and provided the opportunity that civil rights leaders had been seeking to challenge the bus system through organized resistance. The decision to launch a bus boycott was not spontaneous, but rather the culmination of months of planning and preparation by experienced activists who recognized the potential power of economic pressure. When community leaders gathered on the evening of December 5th to form the Montgomery Improvement Association and select a leader for the boycott, Martin found himself thrust into a role for which his entire life had been preparation, yet which still seemed almost overwhelming in its scope and responsibility. At 26 years old, he was chosen to lead what would become one of the most significant protests in American history, a decision that reflected both his growing reputation as an eloquent spokesman and the community's recognition that his relative newcomer status might make him less vulnerable to economic retaliation. Martin's first speech as president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, delivered at Holt Street Baptist Church on the evening of December 5th, revealed the emergence of a leader who could articulate the deepest aspirations of his people while maintaining the moral high ground necessary for sustained resistance. Standing before an overflow crowd of thousands, he declared that they were not advocating violence or hatred, but rather seeking justice through Christian love and nonviolent resistance. His words that evening established the philosophical foundation for the entire civil rights movement. We are not wrong in what we are doing. If we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. The Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted 381 days, transformed Martin from a local pastor into an international symbol of nonviolent resistance to racial oppression. The boycott's success depended not just on the moral leadership that Martin provided, but also on the extraordinary organizational skills of the African American community and the sacrifices made by thousands of ordinary people who walked miles to work each day rather than submit to the humiliation of segregated transportation. The boycott demonstrated the economic power of the African American community and the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance as a strategy for social change. Throughout the boycott, Martin faced constant threats to his life and the lives of his family members. His home was bombed on January 30th, 1956, while Coretta and their infant daughter Yolanda were inside. The attack could have marked the end of the boycott if it had provoked the violent retaliation that many in the community desired. Instead, Martin's response to the bombing revealed the depth of his commitment to nonviolence and his extraordinary ability to transform moments of crisis into opportunities for moral leadership. Standing on his damaged front porch before an angry crowd, he urged calm and forgiveness, declaring that we must love our white brothers no matter what they do to us. The legal challenge to bus segregation proceeded simultaneously with the boycott, culminating in the Supreme Court's decision in Browder v. The legal challenge to bus segregation proceeded simultaneously with the boycott, culminating in the Supreme Court's decision in Browder v. Gale, which declared Montgomery's bus segregation laws unconstitutional. On December 20th, 1956, Martin boarded a Montgomery city bus and took a seat in the front, marking the end of the boycott and the beginning of his emergence as the most prominent leader of the civil rights movement. The young pastor, who had arrived in Montgomery just 2 years earlier as an unknown doctoral student, had become a national figure whose philosophy of nonviolent resistance would inspire movements for social justice around the world. Chapter 5: Downfall, Death, and Legacy. Chapter 5: Downfall, Death, and Legacy. The years following Martin Luther King Jr.'s Nobel Peace Prize triumph in 1964 would prove to be the most challenging and transformative period of his life, as the civil rights leader found himself navigating increasingly treacherous waters both within the movement and in American society at large. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 had achieved many of the movement's initial goals, but these legislative victories also revealed the deeper, more intractable problems of economic inequality, urban poverty, and systemic racism that legal remedies alone could not address. As Martin entered this final phase of his life, he would confront not only external opposition, but also internal doubts about the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance in addressing these more complex challenges. The Selma to Montgomery marches of 1965 represented both a triumphant culmination of the voting rights campaign and a harbinger of the difficulties that lay ahead. The brutal attack on peaceful demonstrators at the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, March 7, 1965, shocked the nation and created the political momentum necessary for passage of the Voting Rights Act. However, the violence also revealed the depths of white resistance to racial equality and foreshadowed the increasingly militant opposition that Martin would face in his final years. The images of state troopers beating defenseless marchers with clubs and attacking them with tear gas created a moral crisis that compelled federal intervention. but they also demonstrated that progress would continue to exact a terrible price in human suffering. As the civil rights movement achieved its major legislative goals, Martin began to expand his focus beyond the traditional concerns of Southern segregation to address the broader issues of economic justice and American militarism. His decision to speak out against the Vietnam War in 1967 marked a crucial turning point that would cost him significant support among both white liberals and moderate African American leaders. The speech at Riverside Church in New York City on April 4, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, represented Martin's most comprehensive critique of American foreign policy and his most explicit connection of civil rights to broader questions of social justice and human rights. In his Riverside Church address, Martin declared that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today was his own government, a statement that shocked many supporters who had viewed him primarily as a civil rights leader rather than a radical critic of American society. His argument that the Vietnam War was draining resources that could be used to address poverty and inequality at home, while also perpetuating the same racist attitudes that had justified segregation, revealed the evolution of his thinking toward a more comprehensive critique of American capitalism and militarism. The backlash against Martin's anti-war stance was swift and devastating. The NAACP Board of Directors publicly repudiated his position, arguing that linking civil rights to foreign policy would damage the movement's credibility and alienate potential allies. Major newspapers, including the Washington Post and the New York Times, criticized his speech as irresponsible and naive. Most painfully, President Lyndon Johnson, who had been a crucial ally in passing civil rights legislation, effectively ended his relationship with Martin and began treating him as a political enemy rather than a partner in social reform. The criticism of his anti-war stance coincided with growing challenges to Martin's leadership from within the civil rights movement itself. Younger activists, influenced by the Black Power movement, and leaders like Stokely Carmichael and H. Rap Brown, increasingly questioned the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance and integration as strategies for achieving racial equality. The urban riots that erupted in Watts, Detroit, Newark, and other cities during the mid-1960s seemed to suggest that many African Americans had lost faith in Martin's philosophy of love and reconciliation and were turning instead to more militant approaches to social change. Martin's response to these challenges revealed both his unwavering commitment to nonviolent principles and his growing understanding of the limitations of his approach. He acknowledged the frustration and anger that fueled the urban uprisings, while continuing to argue that violence would ultimately prove counterproductive and self-defeating. His efforts to address urban poverty through the Chicago Freedom Movement in 1966 had met with limited success, revealing the difficulty of applying Southern civil rights tactics to the more complex problems of Northern cities. The Poor People's Campaign of 1968 represented Martin's most ambitious attempt to address economic inequality through nonviolent direct action. The campaign's goal was to bring thousands of poor people from across the country to Washington, D.C. to demand federal action on poverty, unemployment, and inadequate housing. The plan called for establishing a tent city on the National Mall and maintaining a sustained presence until Congress passed meaningful anti-poverty legislation. This campaign reflected Martin's evolution toward a more radical critique of American economic systems and his recognition that racial equality was meaningless without economic justice. However, the Poor People's Campaign also revealed the growing isolation of Martin's leadership and the difficulty of maintaining unity within a movement that was increasingly fragmented along ideological and generational lines. Many civil rights organizations were reluctant to support a campaign that seemed to go beyond traditional civil rights concerns, while younger activists questioned whether nonviolent tactics could address the systemic nature of economic oppression. The final months of Martin's life were marked by a profound sense of urgency and foreboding. He had received numerous death threats throughout his career, but the level of hostility he faced in 1967 and 1968 seemed to intensify as his critique of American society became more comprehensive and radical. The FBI's surveillance and harassment campaign, directed by J. Edgar Hoover, had escalated to include attempts to destroy his marriage and reputation through the release of compromising recordings and documents. Martin's last major speech, delivered at Mason Temple in Memphis on April 3, 1968, revealed his awareness that his life was in danger while also demonstrating his continued commitment to the struggle for justice. He had come to Memphis to support striking sanitation workers whose demands for union recognition and decent wages embodied the connection between civil rights and economic justice that had become central to his thinking. The speech, known as "I've Been to the Mountaintop," contained prophetic references to his own mortality and his vision of the promised land of racial equality that he might not live to see. On the evening of April 4, 1968, as Martin stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, a single rifle shot ended the life of the most important civil rights leader in American history. James Earl Ray's bullet not only killed Martin Luther King Jr., but also marked the end of an era in the struggle for racial equality. The assassination triggered riots in over 100 cities across the United States, as African Americans expressed their grief and rage at the loss of the leader who had preached love and nonviolence, even in the face of hatred and brutality. The immediate aftermath of Martin's assassination revealed both the depth of his impact on American society and the unfinished nature of his work. President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act just 7 days after the assassination, legislation that had been stalled in Congress but was passed as a tribute to Martin's memory. However, the urban riots that followed his death also demonstrated that many African Americans had already moved beyond his philosophy of nonviolent resistance and integration toward more militant approaches to achieving racial equality. The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. extends far beyond his role in the civil rights movement to encompass his contributions to American The legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. extends far beyond his role in the civil rights movement to encompass his contributions to American democracy, international human rights, and the global struggle for social justice. His philosophy of nonviolent resistance influenced liberation movements around the world, from Northern Ireland to South Africa to Eastern Europe. His vision of the beloved community, a society based on justice, equal opportunity, and love, continues to inspire activists and reformers who seek to address contemporary problems of inequality and injustice. The establishment of Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a federal holiday in 1983 represented official recognition of his contributions to American society, but it also raised questions about whether the institutionalization of his memory had sanitized his more radical critiques of American capitalism and militarism. The tendency to remember Martin primarily as a dreamer of racial harmony, rather than as a critic of economic inequality and American foreign policy, reflects the ongoing difficulty of confronting the full implications of his message. The continuing relevance of Martin's legacy is evident in contemporary movements for social justice, from Black Lives Matter to campaigns for economic equality and immigrant rights. His techniques of nonviolent resistance, his ability to frame political issues in moral terms, and his vision of a society based on justice rather than privilege continue to provide inspiration and guidance for those who seek to create a more equitable world. Perhaps most importantly, Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and death remind us that the struggle for justice requires not just legal and political changes, but also a fundamental transformation of human hearts and minds. His belief that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, reflects an optimism about human nature and social progress that continues to inspire hope even in the darkest of times. The young pastor who began his career in Montgomery, believing in the power of love to overcome hatred, left behind a legacy that continues to challenge Americans to live up to their highest ideals and to create the beloved community that remains his greatest gift to future generations. If this exploration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life has moved you and deepened your appreciation for the complexity of historical change, please like this video and subscribe to Icons of History. We're committed to bringing you these intimate portraits of the remarkable individuals who shaped our world, revealing not just their public triumphs, but also their private struggles and the human elements that made their achievements possible.